So we decided to extend this series, Forest for the Trees, and actually take a passage and do what we've been talking about in this series in terms of looking at it from sort of these different angles and these different perspectives. This whole series has been about feeling as though sometimes there's this message being communicated and we miss all of it in terms of the scriptures. And we have this perception of this is the way the story was, or this is the narrative that was going on, or this is the biblical character situation. And then we have this sort of newer or fresher or maybe more developed or emerged experience. And so we've been sort of speaking into both spaces. We've been talking maybe more philosophically than in terms of exegetically and taking a passage and sort of breaking it down. And so what we decided to do was over the next few weeks look at maybe one of the most, provocative passages in all of the Bible when Jesus tells this story of the prodigal son. And now if you've been a part of church at all, typically you've heard the one angle from the runaway son, the prodigal son, the son that kind of blew off his family. And so we'll talk some about that today. But we also want to come at it from some different angles and sort of shift the gem a little bit in the crystal, and so we can look at it differently over the next several weeks and hopefully implement some of the ways in which we've been talking about how we can interpret and bring in the scriptural practices and tools that we've been talking about and then doing it the next several weeks. And so we're really excited about this story. And I'm going to give you a condensed version of it this morning. And that what I want to do is just speak to some of the variables of this story that I think are so profound from the perspective of the prodigal son. So that's kind of where I'm going to take us this morning. So there's many of you are maybe familiar with this, and if some of you are not, hopefully it'll make sense to you this morning. So Jesus is telling this story. He's telling this parable. And basically a parable is similar to that of an allegory or a fable. It's a story that gives meaning to something and gives you a spin on life in a way in which you never maybe saw that spin before. It kind of brings to surface something that you assumed, but you get to see it from a fresh perspective. And so that's exactly what Jesus is doing here. And Jesus is specifically talking to two groups as he's telling people about this parable, this story. The one group are the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders of the day. And the second group are the non-Jews, the Gentiles, perceivably the sort of the bad crowd, the prodigal people that are not doing all the right things. And so this story is referencing those groups of people, those two groups. And so Jesus writes in Luke 15. So basically the son goes to his father and says, "Dad, here's the deal. I want my inheritance." The father gives him his inheritance. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. So riotous living, I don't know, that's a funny word to me. So the son takes all his resources from his dad, and he burns it all in a brief period of time in some other faraway place. So he has left the fold of his Jewish tribe, of his Jewish culture. And when he came to himself, so he lost it all, he finds himself in this horrific predicament. He's hungry, he's broke. The story says he's literally feeding pigs. So again, the Jewish consciousness says, man, that's profound because that's not a kosher thing to do in a very literal sense. And so there's something sort of oxymoronic about that in terms of the profundity of the story. So when he came to himself, hungry, he said, "I will rise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you." And he rose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. So it's this beautiful story of redemption, this beautiful story of wrongs being made right. And in one sense, that's profound in and of itself. But it seems as though there might be some sort of deeper, more subversive things that Jesus is trying to say as he's communicating this story to these two groups of people, the religious leaders and to the Gentiles. And so there's the beginning part of it. Imagine your son coming to you and saying, "Dad, I want my inheritance." In my case, I would laugh because there really is no inheritance. But nonetheless, if your child came to you and said, "I want my inheritance," and what that would mean in first century Judaism would have been very different than today. Because fundamentally, the only asset you and I would have owned 2,000 years ago, for the most part, would have been land. And even though you might have a child to give that land to, you wouldn't give that land to them. They would not inherit it until you passed, until you died. So when the son is making the audacious ask, Dad, I want my inheritance, the only way his son can actually take the inheritance is if he sells the land. Some scholars argue that the older son would have typically gotten 2/3 of the estate, and the younger son would have gotten 1/3. Just the way it kind of would have worked, the first and second born. So potentially, in this story, again, in the Jewish consciousness, as the people are hearing this, they would have understood that the father potentially would have given 1/3 of his land. They would have had to sell the land, and now the kid goes away. But what is really the son saying to the father? Not only are you invaluable to me, not only do I not care about you, not only are you meaningless to me, but I see you as dead, because the land would never go away from the father until he were to actually pass and then be able to give it to his sons. He said, you're dead to me, you're worthless to me. Now the context here is important to understand. That the general reading of this story is that the father in the story is God. And that the brother in the story, which we're going to really talk about much today, the brother in the story, who's faithful, who stays home, who's predictable, who's reliable, who's helping maintain the farm, he is the religious leaders. That he's the one doing all the right things. And then the Gentiles, those that are sort of far from God, the non-Jews, those are the son that has taken his third and has run off. And so when you begin to look at this passage, a whole bunch of things kind of surface for me. And one of the chunks of phrasing that jumped off the page was when he was sitting in the slop. He was feeding pigs. He had lost everything in this distant land. All the friends that he was partying with have now left him because he's got no more resources. And he was at a complete place of brokenness. And in that space of brokenness, the writer, Jesus says, he came to himself. That in that space of brokenness, he became aware. That all of a sudden things became much clearer because he had nothing else to get in the way. In brokenness, it will wake us up like that. It will force us to see the world through a very different lens. And so he's sitting there in this slop with swine, in an unclean, hanging out with unclean animals. Again, in Jewish consciousness, certain animals were considered unclean. And if you touched or came near those animals, you would have to go through a ritual to become clean again, so then you could go back into the temple and actually engage God. So the symbolism of this is this boy is living with pigs, and in that space he is unclean and disconnected between he and his father. And so the brokenness, what it does, it begins to help you understand maybe where you sit with things. Maybe how we begin to realize how off we are in our connection to each other or connection to God himself. And so he sits there and he ponders. He strategizes. He says, well, I'm going to have this conversation in my head that I want to have with my father so that he'll let me in, so that I can at least have a warm bed and good food, and I could at least be a servant and work for my father. He's having this dialogue in a sense like he's strategizing. When I go back to Dad, what am I going to say? So was his motive, I want out of this bad situation and I want a better situation? Or was his motive, man, God, Dad, I'm so sorry for what I did. Was there a sense of any kind of intent for forgiveness? What was he really trying to do in that? And we just don't know. But one of these things I understand is in my household, I have two boys, soon to be 14 and 11. And the thing that's been really interesting is at 11 and 14, they know everything. They're brilliant, or at least they think they are. Every time you give them an idea or you tell them they should do something, invariably they have a better way of doing it, or they think their way is right. Like, Colson, it's Saturday and you cut the grass every Saturday. And then you got there to cut the grass. Dad, it doesn't need to be cut today. Why don't we do it every other week? And he goes, and it's this massive diatribe of back and forth. And Keen, you got to go out there and make sure you get the dog poop off the yard so Colson can push the lawnmower. And it's this massive drama. Why do we got to pick up after the dog? Why do we got to cut the grass? And it becomes almost every Saturday. It's this. And this back and forth. Nobody else is having to cut grass in our yard. Nobody else is picking up dog poop and they're not. But in our household, you are. And Dad, how come you don't do it? You used to do it, and I know, but now I have you, so I don't have to do it. And you have all this dance back and forth. And what starts to often happen, and sometimes I find myself if I get sucked into it, it'll amp up. Now, maybe none of you have ever done this in your home. In my home, sometimes we have really thin windows, and God only knows what our neighbors can hear. But sometimes it gets a little bit louder, it's a little bit more intense. My boys have mastered the English language a little bit better, so their debating skills are a little bit heightened. And often they will push the envelope in terms of maybe being disrespectful. I don't know. I think they do. And what will happen, this happens all the time. Colson, don't talk to your mom that way. Or she'll say to Colson or my youngest son, don't talk to your father that way. And invariably, it'll get to a point where we've got to shut it down, and then the other parent, who's not being yelled at, says, make sure, son, that you tell your father you're sorry. Sorry. Do they mean it? Of course not. But as a parent, you'll take it however you can get it, right? So if they come to you legitimately sorry, you're like, oh, that's awesome. If they come to you with a sense of, all right, Dad, I'm sorry, and you know they're really not, it sort of doesn't matter. And I wonder if the father in this story would have maybe felt the same. Right? The kids returning, it doesn't matter what the motive is. It doesn't matter what the intent is. The fact is that he is home. The fact that he is coming back, that's all that matters. And the beauty of this story, the beauty of what it means for us to connect with God is basically saying in this, Jesus is saying in this about God is, God does not care what you bring to the table, why you bring it. He doesn't even care about the motive. All he cares about is that you show up. All he cares about is that you connect, that you long to be there, and he wants to connect and longs to engage us. And the story goes on and talks about, and this to me is probably one of the most moving pieces of the whole story. The father has compassion on his son, and he runs out to the son. Now, again, in Jewish consciousness, this would have been a strange thing to do. That for the most part, as a male leader of your home, as a sort of hierarchical space, typically the male leader of the home would rarely go towards people or go to people. They would come to him. Makes no sense in our context, but that was the assumption a couple thousand years ago. Invariably, you would be commissioned to see Dad or to see the patriarch, but he or she or he would never go to you. So in this story, which seemingly is strange to the Jewish mindset, because a dignified elder statesman, leader of the home, community figure would never run to his son, especially one that has treated him so poorly. And so the father was deeply humiliated just maybe weeks or months earlier when the son leaves. He sells everything he has. He, in essence, he sells a third of his estate and gives it to his kid. In essence, the son is saying, Dad, you're dead to me. You're meaningless to me. And what does the father do? The moment he sees them, in spite of his dignified state, he jumps up and runs. He goes after his son. And Jesus is trying to make a statement here. He's trying to make a statement about God, and I think it's quite interesting because again, you and I wouldn't know this intuitively because we aren't Jewish in the first century. But in the culture that would have been, again, a Jewish awareness, especially a couple thousand years ago, if you left your Jewish community, if you left your tribe, if you left your group, and you went out and you engaged with other Gentiles, or I don't know, you married somebody that was not a part of the Jewish infrastructure, you were seen as an outsider. And if you ever wanted to come back to the fold, that was not something that you could just walk into. You had to go through this experience. It was called this Gesheha ceremony. And in this ceremony, they would do all these things to sort of embarrass you. You would come back, and then you would have to sit through this ritual of they would throw things and they would break things, and you were sort of seething with the angst of what you had to, what you've come through, and they wanted to make sure that you understood if you were coming back that you could not do this again. And you were reminded as to why you left in the first place. And so all this stuff was going on. And you were potentially deeply humiliated. So what some scholars argue, the story that Jesus really is saying here, but he's not really saying it, that you would have understood if you were a first century Jew, would have been that the father is running to the son because the community is trying to get to the son to push him through this ceremony so they can embarrass him. And it's as though the father's saying, here's the deal. I got him. He's mine. I'm not going to put him through this. What Jesus seemingly is saying in this, and I think it's okay to read between the lines in this. This is what you can do with parables. You can read between the lines. What Jesus is saying here is God is not concerned about your moral decisions. He doesn't care that you made bad moral decisions. Now, we shouldn't make bad moral calls. It's not, you don't want to be in community that way. That's not a healthy way to live in community. That's not a healthy way to connect with each other. But the richer statement here is God is saying, I long for connection with you regardless of your decisions. As a matter of fact, I am going to go after you. And if you don't want me, I can't force you on me, but I'm going to actually go after you and give you an opportunity to respond to me. And part of the piece of this that is so, I guess, rich for me is the story assumes that the father was waiting for the son to show up. This beautiful redemptive state of a humble, of an accessible father, or a humble or accessible God. This is a different understanding of God than most of us, let alone first century Judaism, would have ever assumed on God. God was this dictatorial, sort of angry, and if you didn't live up to his expectation view of that's who God was. And Jesus is painting a completely redemptive, restorative perspective of how God is and who he is. What this story begins to do is it helps us play with the tapes that are in our head. I don't know about you, but I have often these messages, these assumptions, these noises that I live with. Sometimes they're true. Often, I think they're fear-based, they're worst-case scenario-based. Maybe they're rooted in insecurity, they're rooted in maybe poor decisions in a previous life and previous work experience, whatever it might be. And we find ourselves living with these tapes, these messages that we are less than that we're not valuable, or that we don't matter. And you can only begin to imagine the son as he's returning home. He feels inadequate. He knows he embarrassed his father. He knows not only did he consume his father's wealth, but he's coming home with nothing. That he went out to sort of find himself and lost himself, but maybe now he's actually kind of refound himself. And in that space, he's coming home with all these tapes that are playing. I'm worthless because of whatever the reasons, however you'd see himself as worthless. Maybe for some of us in this space, you sit there with these tapes that are playing that define yourself in a way that is not accurate. I don't like the way my body is shaped, so I'm not sort of what I should be, or what I think I should be, or what culture tells me I should be, or I don't like the color of my skin, or I don't like the job I have, and so I wish I could make more money so that I could have some kind of status and so people would respect me differently, or I have these tapes that play in my mind because maybe I see myself as not as valuable, or somehow not the right mom or the right dad, because maybe my parenting situation isn't like I would like it to be. Or maybe you sit here and you feel like there is no way God would ever want you back because you've done something too horrific. Or maybe if Watershed really knew your story, we would not want you in this space, so you put on this facade and we get to see that person, but we're really missing out on the deeper person of who you are. Because this story is about a son returning to his dad with a horrific worldview of himself, and his dad says, not only do I not care about that, but actually, and this text doesn't when I read you earlier, doesn't show the whole piece of it, but they actually threw this massive party for the son. Huge party. His father gives him his ring. He takes his coat off him and gives him his coat. This huge welcome back. There's no mention of, now let's make sure we get everything organized first in terms of the relationship we have here. You hurt me. I'm angered by this. Let's go to therapy. Let's go to counseling. Get everything worked out. Then celebrate. That's not at all what happened. The story was like, come on in. Let's go. I'm running after you. Bring you back. Let's have a party. You're welcome. You're welcomed in. And it's as though the father is saying, it's as though God is saying, whatever tapes are in your head, they are not always reality. This past week, my sons are with my in-laws in South Florida where they live. It's one of the, I don't want to say it was the most enjoyable week of my year, but it's been a wonderful week. I would never say that. And invariably, when it happens, maybe we'll take some time off and stay home and like do projects around the house. Or in this week, we didn't have the luxury of well, we didn't have the luxury of not working. There was too much to be done. So, however, we got out of town. We got this old vintage Airstream that we've been working on, or it's been working on us. I'm not sure how to look at it. And went to South Carolina, this little state park, and parked in front of just this beautiful lake for, I don't know, 4 or 5 days, and worked. I mean, up at 5:30, plowing. But in the meantime, had some great conversations. Nobody was needing anything it was just us together, and we were getting stuff done and talking. And in those moments, what I find happens is often I feel like I can be more vulnerable because there's nothing interrupting. And I was sharing with Taryn, so I've got like these multiple personalities of careers that I have. So I've got Watershed, and I got this job, and I deeply love it. And I have this other job where we have this small business, and we've been doing that for almost 10 years now. And there's so much joy in that space as well, because I feel like I have this luxury of being in the world that some of you live in, 9 to 5, and then I can come back here and have this space as well. So I've really enjoyed that. But invariably, both spaces at different times, I will feel deeply inadequate in my role. And I think that's normal, but I don't know. I just know you go through seasons where I feel like I'm hitting it well, and then there are other times this is just. And in my other space, there's some areas that I'm personally struggling in, and I'm struggling with making the right decisions and future decisions and all these things that are just are sort of wreaking havoc on how I perceive myself. I have these tapes that are playing. I'm inadequate. I'm not. I've gotten in over my head. What do I know? And there's too many people, and I can't stay on top of it well. And they have demands, and I don't serve them well, and I want to do better. And all this stuff, and I found myself just unleashing all this on my wife. And often, my wife will set me in my place and say, "Well, you made the bed, now lie in it," kind of deal. And that's fine, because there's some truth to that. Or other times, "No, they're idiots, they're wrong." And so she jumps into my camp with me. That's fine, but in this time, it was like she just sat there calmly, and she helped me reset the tapes. Scott, this perception that you have it's not right. It's not accurate. Here, let me tell you my version of truth on that. And no, Scott, you think that, but that's not really what's going on. And all of a sudden, I began to kind of come into this, okay, I see it more clearly. I see it from a different perspective. The whole conversation, the whole connection with God, maybe at its most meta conversation, meta narrative perspective, is exactly that. He gives you a different perspective of how you see yourself. We have this shadow self back here that haunts us, right? It's this message, this narrative. Most of us are not even aware of it. We've talked a lot about that around here. The shadow self tells you all these things about who you are. It tells you that you're inadequate. It tells you that you're whatever the things are. It tells you that you're awesome at something when you're not, right? That's the shadow self. It's this false reality. And we often don't see it, but you know what? Everybody else does. Everybody else knows it's there. And so the more aware you become, the more you see that shadow space, and then you can identify it, and you can move from there. This whole story is like God saying, listen, yes, you have a shadow space, and I fundamentally don't care what it is, because ultimately I just want to connect with you. Ultimately, my connection, my restoration, my redemption is to be in connection with you. So how he sees us, it changes us. It's all about connecting. And I don't know if I can say this piece more intensely. I don't know how else to say it. But the church, I think there's so many things that we miss at times. But I think our perception of God, and if we step back and we never say, so give me define God for me, and give me a list of things. We have a whole bunch of different things on that list. And one of the things I'm sure that all of us would have on the list would be some kind of like lifeguard in terms of our morality. That God somehow would be pleased when we're doing a certain set of right rules, and he'd be unpleased with us, or she would be unpleased with us if we were doing a wrong set of rules, right? So it's this moral dance. And I think for most of us, our grid of God is a moral grid. It's what we've been taught. It's, I think, one of the biggest lies the church for 2,000 years has propagated. And my colleagues and my friends, I don't think I'm heretical on this. But this story to me is one more prime example of the image of God as the dad. Jesus is telling this story. The image of God is the dad who's having zero dialogue over the sins and the imperfections of his son. Because God's economy is not rooted in moral decisions. Now, we choose to be moral, whatever again, morality is all, you can be all over the place with that. We choose to make good decisions. I don't need the Bible to give me the 10 Commandments. I know I shouldn't sleep with my neighbor's wife or husband or whatever, right? I know I shouldn't steal from people around me. I know I shouldn't kill people. And these are just sort of like human assumptions. So do I need God or the Bible to help me with that stuff? No. Because the role of God is not to be moral police. The role of God is for connection. This story is 100% about what does it mean for us to be in connection with God, no matter what tapes are playing in your mind, no matter how wicked you think you are, no matter how bad your decisions are in the past. God's saying, it's your problem if you're getting that stuff in the way, because I am not making that a problem. And I think it's one of the things that we have not been good to waking up to. The thing is about this story is it's kind of an open-ended story. I mean, it ends pretty good in terms of the younger brother. The older brother, it didn't go so good, actually. It's kind of jacked up a little bit, and we'll talk more about that next week. But the beauty of the story is that it ends chaotically a little bit. That's life. That's relationship. That's our connection with God. That's our connection with each other. Again, the allegory and the metaphor, and it's all so richly, deeply connected. So when I look at this whole piece here, there's like this sort of aha that I had in the last couple of weeks. And I sit with these talks maybe for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks at the most usually, sometimes a little bit longer, knowing that where we're going to go with certain things. And this has been maybe one of the most, reflective, maybe like healing, maybe devotional kinds of talks I've had in a long time. And everything I talked about today, in one sense, is stuff I've kind of known in my head, or maybe I've heard other people talk about over the years. But for whatever reason, there's been something about this talk for me that has been healing. It's been this reminder of connection with God. And so here's been this journey. So you look at the Old Testament, and the view, the Jewish consciousness of the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the beginning chunk of it. The assumption of God, for the most part, was that he was this essence. I wouldn't even use personal pronouns, that it was essence. A movement, power, breath, zero personality. It was the beginning of all that is. That was the assumed Jewish understanding of God. As a matter of fact, God was so sacred that they wouldn't even use the name. So he was deeply removed from this sort of accessible space. And then as you move along in the Old Testament, you see sort of, if I can use the word, an evolving awareness of how we define God. You see David writing in the Psalms a little bit about a God that is righteous, a God that's wrathful. So you see this dark side of God. And then you see a God that is also loving and caring. And so you begin to see this evolving sense that God is this sort of essence out there, and we begin to put metaphor and imagery, like human metaphor and imagery, to who God is in terms of anger or loving, some of these sort of personas, these I don't even want to say personalities yet. And then you jump into the New Testament, and Jesus comes on the scene, and he explodes this into reality. That God is not just some essence out there, that actually God is, if I need to give the metaphor, is a father. That God is a loving, caring person. Now again, for some of you, I get it. The parental imagery does not work well for all the reasons that it shouldn't work well for you, and I'm sorry for that. But I think you understand where this is going, where Jesus was going with this, that he was giving us imagery that made us figure out ways to connect to God, albeit, again, metaphor and imagery. But it was all about God saying in this story, come home. I'm here. I want to connect with you. I want to know what it's like to re-engage you. Because are we not always on the consummate search for a sense of connection, whether it be with each other, whether it be with something else out there? Like there's something driving us. We're longing for things to somehow be made right. It's in many ways what keeps us going. There was a couple visiting a few weeks back, and I had just met them. That was their second week visiting, and they had been here, I guess, the week prior, and relatively young, but they had, for whatever reason, they had gone through a really horrific experience in some other kind of church or religious experience. And I think they were in a paid post in ministry or something, and it just went sideways. And And simultaneously to all that, they were just questioning so much of their journey, their spiritual journey. And they're sharing all this with me. I'm sitting back there at the end. We're kind of this last call thing. We get to meet a lot of new folks and really enjoy that conversation. And I found myself, and they're like pouring this all out. I mean, they're hurting, they're angry, they're seething a little bit, they're concerned, there's fear. And I begin to smile a little bit. I'm trying not to because it looks, like you're an idiot. You're smiling when I'm going through difficulty right now. But it was this grin, and I quickly said, I hear you. And you need to know that this church is full of people like you. You thought one way, and now you're seeing things differently. You made poor decisions, and now you want to make different decisions. And you're wondering who you are in this space. You can be whoever it is that you feel like God is kind of morphing you to become. That you don't have to have it all figured out. Yeah, you go to preface, that'll be good. Ask questions. But I promise you, there are dozens, if not hundreds of people here who have been on the same journey that you are on. They had a perception of God that's blown up, and they've felt alone at times, and they've had to sort of organize who they are and who God is in their lives now. And they're finding God in a different way, and they're doing it in community with other people who are asking some very honest questions. And so if I'm smiling a little bit while you're saying this, it's because welcome home. This is your tribe. I get your reality. Oh, I get it. And if there's ever a place where you could be safe, if there's ever a place where we could reset the tapes for you, if there's ever a space where you could re-engage God in ways that maybe were 10 times better than you ever did before, because you're going to do it with a sense of honesty. You're going to do it with a sense of, oh man, it's not all about getting all my moral junk in order so that I can somehow engage God. It's like, no, he's just like, all you got to do is like, I'm here, God. I want this. And then the journey for us is, all right, what are the tools that we can play with? How has it worked for you in your discovery with God? Because I want to learn from that. Oh, wow, that was rich. Oh, okay. Well, here's something that kind of worked in my economy. Oh, okay, that might be helpful. And oh, wait, Sue, what about you? And in the back, that was, oh yeah, I hear that. And so we get to learn from each other and grow from each other. I don't sit here, nor do any of our staff or any of our leaders, as somehow proverbial experts. We sit here in the same place we all are in this community here. We're vulnerable before God, saying, God, what does it mean to connect with you? Not because we're trying to patronize you or somehow please you because you somehow need us to patronize you, but because you've made us and you're our creator. So doesn't it make sense that we want to connect with creation? To carry the parent metaphor, doesn't it make sense that you want to connect with the people that brought you into this world? That's part of reality. It just makes sense. It's our longing, it's our craving. And so, in just a moment, when Austin invites you to sing, maybe this next song needs to be an anthem for who you and God are right now. As you sing these words, maybe you don't care about who's around you. You just get lost in what it means to connect with the kind of God that Jesus is talking about in this space. Because it's a person, he's an essence that I surmise we all desperately need. God, thanks for this group. Thanks for the honesty with which my friends in this space, my loved ones in this space, take on you, take on each other, take on a sense of reality. Father, as we go about our week, may there be those small, short, brief moments driving down the street in the car or getting ready in the morning or cutting the grass in the back. We just have these moments where we slow it down and kind of just remember that the God we get to connect with takes all of us back, wants all of us to connect. And so, Father, may our connection with you be rich this week. May it be special. May it be poignant. May it be intentional. So when we say we love you, we in a very real way sense that back from you. So God, we love you. Thanks for our time together.